What's up, everybody? It's Paul from Boosted Films, and in this video we're going to remove the valve cover from our 10th generation Honda Accord. This specific Accord is the 1.5 liter turbo. The engine is the L15B engine in this one. Although I do believe if you have the 2 liter, the K20C engine, a lot of this stuff is probably going to be similar, so you might find some tips, helpful tips in this video if you're removing a valve cover off of that 2.0 liter version of this Accord as well. I also want to preface this video by saying it was cold when I was doing this. I was outside in a non-heated garage in wintertime. So I tried to film things as best I could, but being as cold as it wasn't always my priority to get everything on film, but we'll walk through what I got. So first things first, of course, you're going to pop your hood, and we're going to take a look under the hood here. There's a few things in the way. These coolant lines here that go to the turbo are kind of in the way of a few bolts holding that valve cover down. So we're going to remove those. And then there's a few plug-ins towards the back side of the intake manifold, and a couple other vacuum lines we got to remove as well. So we're going to jump into all that piece by piece. And the first thing you want to do is remove your coil packs, and there are 10 millimeter bolts there that you're just going to loosen up all of those. And the trick for this is to kind of take those bolts off and then lift up your coil pack a little bit, and then it should come unplugged. Once you lift it up a little ways, you unplug it from that wiring harness and then take your coil pack out the rest of the way. There was an additional plug on the end of that coil pack harness that I unplugged as well. So now we have removed those coil packs, and this wiring harness is always kind of here in the way a little bit, but in order to remove your valve cover, you got to loosen up a few plug-ins that I'm showing back here. I unplugged just to give us more room, more wiggle room to get this whole harness kind of out of the way. And on the left side part, close to the oil fill, this piece you kind of just have to squeeze, and then it pulls up. Whereas on the opposite side, towards the right side of this harness, it kind of has to slide to the right, and then it comes off that way. And I want to mention this now before we get too far along, that you do want to kind of unplug this plug-in I'm showing here that goes to what I believe is the wastegate actuator for the turbo. If you unplug this, it gives you a lot more slack, in this wiring harness later on. So there are some hard lines here. These are just vacuum lines, but this hard line goes over the valve cover. We're going to have to get these hard lines out of the way so we can remove our valve cover. You can see here I already disconnected those hoses in this shot. But I just wanted to show you what I'm doing here in this next shot, since it's actually harder to see what I'm actually doing. I'm currently in the process of removing those vacuum hoses. So there are those two hoses that I showed, and the key to this, or a trick for this that I've kind of learned, is of course you need like a vice grip to remove those clamps. So you squeeze those clamps and move them out of the way so they're not tightening down on that vacuum hose anymore. But then the next trick to getting these vacuum hoses loose is to kind of get them to spin any way you can. So you don't need to don't try to pull them off right away. Try to get them to spin around while they're still actually on. And usually you use like a vice grip or something that can squeeze around and get them to spin loose. Once they can spin a little bit, they're a lot easier to pull off. Then you could pull with a little bit more force, or you could use a screwdriver to try to pull them back and get them off of that metal piece in this case. So again, 2 rubber hoses on the front side of the engine, 2 rubber hoses on the back side, and there's also that bolt holding this piece down on that bracket. And right now I'm actually removing the part where the wiring harness goes through. Once you bring this up like I have now, you can see from the back side, you just got to squeeze this a little bit, and then that clip should kind of pop free. So here is those solid lines that we're removing to get out of the way. And as you can see, there's also another bracket in the back. So there's 2 bolts holding that piece down. Next, we're going to work towards the front side of the valve cover, and this is above our turbo. And these coolant lines run here. We have to remove those to get to all the bolts to take off the valve cover. And then also there is an oxygen sensor plug-in that I'm removing right now. So that's just a simple squeeze style plug-in, and it goes onto a little bracket there as well, if I remember correctly. And then you just can kind of pull that off and get that out of the way. And same story here as with the vacuum lines. These coolant lines will kind of work the same way. Use a vice grip of some kind or pliers of some kind to get those clamps loose, pull them back, get them out of the way so they're no longer holding onto the hard line part. And then again, I recommend just trying to spin them. Get them to spin first before you try really using a lot of force to pull them off. Because if you just try to pull really hard, that might not end up with the best results. So get them to spin freely before you pull them off. These are coolant lines, so there is some fluid in there. Ideally, your engine will be cold when you're doing this, and so just be aware that some coolant might come out, but it should not be very much. And if you want to plug that line, you could have a bolt available just to plug it to prevent much fluid from coming out. But from my experience with this, there really wasn't a lot of fluid coming out at all. Now is also a good time to say if you want to, you can disconnect your battery. It's usually good practice to disconnect your battery terminals as well before you start working under the hood. So if you want to do that, feel free to do that as well. And then we're going to cut to a cell phone shot that gives you a better view of these coolant lines here. And it's actually just the one coolant line, I should say. So you can see where I removed it, and you can see where this hard line runs over. And also that plug-in is there for the oxygen sensor. Now that we've removed those hoses from that hard line, there are a few nuts you need to loosen up, and then you should be able to take those nuts off. 10 millimeter, I believe. I'm getting in there with a wrench at the moment. So remove those two nuts, and then the hard line should come free from those brackets. Well, the brackets stay on the hard line, but you should be able to take off that whole piece. It was a little bit tricky to get out of there, I believe, because of the oxygen sensor bracket part that stays there, but you should be able to finagle it around a little bit enough to get that completely out of the way. Next, we got a vacuum hose going to our valve cover towards the back right here that we're going to release the clamp, and again try to make sure that twists around a little bit before we try to pull it off. So we're going to give it a squeeze, give it a little twist back and forth, and then it should pull free pretty easily. We need to be a bit careful with all this stuff, especially considering that it is plastic. You know, you don't want to squeeze too hard on any of it. It could break or give too much force in one way or another, as it could break. And actually, that's a perfect segue to show you a mistake I made, and hopefully I will prevent you from making the same mistake. This little breather hose here that goes kind of from the valve cover to the intake pipe, it's just that short little piece that I'm removing. This is one of the hardest pieces to kind of get free. I did try my technique that I recommend, of course. I tried squeezing it to get it to spin. It didn't seem to want to spin, and I thought maybe that was just because it's such a short little piece. But I should have kept trying that to get this to spin free, because I used the screwdriver a bit too much to try to get this off. So I would not recommend doing what I'm doing right now, where you're really trying to pry that screwdriver in there. You just got to be careful with the amount of force you put on it, because I basically make the mistake of getting the screwdriver in there and then trying to lift up to get that rubber piece free. And unfortunately, I end up breaking off a piece of plastic, as you can see right about here. Pop. So again, same as the other hoses. This one might just be a little bit harder to work free when you give it that twisting motion, but I recommend doing that again to get this at least free. Because of that, in my case, what I ended up doing was taking that inlet pipe off of the turbo, find that little plastic piece that I broke. Luckily, this will still function just fine. It's just something I don't want you to do that I did, but just something else that added to this job for me. But now at least you get to see how this turbo inlet pipe works. There's just two bolts holding it on down there, so it's not the worst thing to remove. Just a little bit more time out in the cold for me. So next, because we are going to be removing the valve cover itself very soon, you could have did this at any time, but I would try to clean up a little bit close to the areas where that valve cover meets the cylinder head, just because once you do have this valve cover off, your engine is open and exposed to the elements, and we don't want any dirt or debris getting inside our engine, of course. So I just did a little spray down and then wiped around where there was any kind of loose dirt and stuff, just to try to make sure nothing would more easily fall into our engine. So now we're removing the actual bolts that hold the valve cover down. So this is one of the final steps to removing our valve cover. And these are very specific bolts, as you can see. They're all the same though, so everyone is the same. Not anyone has to go any other specific spot, so that is good. Makes it a bit easier. And there are 10 different bolts holding the valve cover down. So we're going to switch to our cell phone camera shot here to show you exactly where all those bolts are after they have been removed. Now, some of them in the back, you might have to move that wiring harness around a little bit to get to see. But it's all pretty open and pretty easy back there. You just probably want an extension. And I believe these were 12 millimeters. Everything is pretty much either 10 or 12 millimeter in this video. So since this valve cover was never removed, and again, since it's plastic, I tried to be gentle with actually pulling it up. I didn't just want to grab one spot and really pulling it because it could potentially break something. So I gradually kind of walked my way around different spots and applied a little bit of force to kind of just unglue this valve cover from the valve cover gasket. And in my case, the valve cover gasket kind of stayed to the cylinder head, which was just fine. But I just worked around and pulled up on different spots to get this free. Of course, if you're trying to pull up and it just feels like it's really, really hard to pull up, double check your bolts. Make sure you removed all those bolts. Make sure there's nothing else around the outside edges of this valve cover kind of holding it down. The only thing holding me up still is this hose that runs to that air intake pipe. Again, make sure you kind of get that free enough where it spins a little bit, and then this is just what worked for me. I found to actually kind of lift up on the valve cover once it was free enough and then go away from me. Pull that valve cover more towards the car, more towards the firewall, and then just pull it off with that hose attached. So there might be a better way of doing that. I'm just a guy trying to document things I do and make videos on YouTube to show people how I did what I did. So doesn't mean I know exactly the perfect way to do these things, which is why I love the comment section. So if you want to comment on what I did wrong, feel free. If you want to comment on a better way that you did something, please add to the discussion. And of course, check the comment section for any updates as well. But now you can see we pretty much have the whole valve cover off. It's just a matter of moving that wiring harness. As you can see here, I actually still didn't have it unplugged yet. I should have had it unplugged close to that turbo wastegate actuator. I should have unplugged that. It would have given me a little more room. But here you can see we got our valve cover pulled off. So now whatever you're doing, if you had to just change a valve cover gasket, or if you had to check your valve lash or something, hopefully now you have access to do so. And before I end this video, I'm just going to show you a couple more shots from the cell phone, what it looks like when the valve cover is off. Just some basics here. You know, this is cylinder 1, cylinder 2 is here, cylinder 3 is here, and cylinder 4 is at the very end. So cylinder 1 starts on the left, closest to the cam gears. And this here is, and it goes left to right. And of course, I'm showing our cams here now, that the one furthest away from us is the intake, and the one closest to us is the exhaust cam. So those are your camshafts. And if you were going to check your valve lash, you would be doing something like this. And that's a whole nother video. There's a lot more behind actually checking and adjusting your valve lash. So you may have to do some more research on that if that's what you're here for, as far as actually doing that process. But that's it, guys. That's all I really have for this video. So as always, I appreciate everybody watching. Hopefully you found this helpful to at least see how I did this on my 10th generation Accord. So as always, this is Paul from Boosted Films saying thanks so much for watching.